There is a version of your life that only becomes possible when you stop negotiating with your own weakness. Not the weakness you show the world, but the one you protect in private. The one that speaks in excuses and delays and comfort disguised as balance. Most people never confront it. They decorate it. They rename it. They live their entire existence inside its limits and call it personality. Stoicism was never meant to be gentle. It was built for this exact fracture in the human mind, where intention and behavior stop matching, where you know what is right, yet consistently choose what is easy. And the first brutal truth you have to understand is this: your life is not shaped by what happens to you, but by how consistently you abandon yourself in small moments when no one is watching. Not in disasters, not in rare defining events, but in the ordinary seconds where discipline should exist and doesn't. The mind resists this idea because it removes the comfort of blaming circumstances. It forces ownership, but ownership is the beginning of strength. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, not as a philosophy of comfort, but as a weapon of clarity. There are things you command and things you never will. Your thoughts, your actions, your judgments belong to you. Everything else does not. Yet most suffering comes from reversing this order, from trying to control what is external while neglecting the internal machinery that actually defines you. You cannot control how others speak about you, but you can control whether their words move you. You cannot control timing, but you can control preparation. You cannot control chaos, but you can control whether you become fragile in its presence. And here is where most people quietly collapse. They spend their energy fighting invisible battles outside their reach while neglecting the only domain where victory is possible. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself not as a philosopher on a stage, but as a commander reminding himself not to lose discipline in the middle of power. Because power without internal control is decay waiting for opportunity. So ask yourself honestly, not in theory, but in behavior, how much of your mental energy today was spent reacting to what you cannot change, and how much was invested in mastering what you can. That imbalance is the beginning of mental weakness. Now understand the second truth, and this is where comfort begins to crack further. Silence is not emptiness. It is strategy. And strategic silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of power in modern life. People assume visibility equals value. They assume explanation equals legitimacy. They assume reaction equals strength. All of it is false. The more you expose your intentions prematurely, the more you distribute control over your outcome into the hands of others. Every opinion you invite becomes a pressure point. Every update becomes a source of interference. Every explanation becomes a negotiation. The strongest individuals in history understood this instinctively. They did not announce every move. They did not broadcast every plan. They moved in silence, not because they were hiding, but because they understood a simple principle. Energy leaks through attention. When you are constantly explaining yourself, you are not building. You are defending. And a defensive mind is never fully focused on creation. There is a reason Stoic discipline includes restraint not only in action, but in speech. Words are not neutral. They are commitments. The more you speak, the more you bind yourself to expectations that may not serve your path. Silence, then, is not withdrawal from life. It is removal of interference so that action can become precise. But silence also demands something harder than speaking: restraint in reaction. The urge to respond immediately, to correct, to defend, to prove. That urge is emotional, not strategic. And if you obey it too often, you will notice something subtle but destructive. Your life becomes reactive instead of directed. A reactive mind does not lead, it follows triggers. Now consider the third truth, and this one cuts deeper than most people are willing to accept. You are not weak because you lack knowledge. You are weak because you repeatedly betray your own decisions. Every time you decide to wake up early and don't, you teach your mind that your word is optional. Every time you commit to focus and then drift into distraction, you reinforce internal instability. Every time you choose comfort over discipline, you don't just lose progress. You reshape identity. Stoicism does not treat discipline as motivation. It treats it as integrity. A man or woman who cannot keep promises to themselves becomes psychologically fragmented. There is no internal authority, only impulses competing for control. This is why radical self-discipline is not about intensity. It is about consistency. The Stoics understood that transformation is not a dramatic event. It is repetition of aligned action until identity stabilizes around it. And here is the part most people resist. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. Your systems are nothing more than repeated choices. And your repeated choices reveal your true nature far more accurately than your intentions ever will. So if your life feels unstable, do not rush to blame circumstances. Look at your daily micro-decisions. Look at where you allow exceptions. Look at where you just this once yourself into weakness, because just this once is never once. Now the fourth truth is where most people feel the most resistance, because it directly attacks ego. Your need for approval is quietly controlling more of your life than you are willing to admit. It does not announce itself. It disguises itself as politeness, professionalism, awareness, humility, but underneath it is a constant scanning of external judgment, a hidden negotiation between your actions and imagined reactions of others. This is why criticism hurts more than it should, not because it is accurate, but because it exposes dependence. The Stoic position is not to become arrogant or dismissive of feedback. It is to remove emotional dependence on it, to treat external judgment as noise, not authority. If your sense of worth rises and falls based on praise, you are not stable. You are externally regulated, and anything externally regulated can be destabilized instantly. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in history, constantly reminded himself that praise and insult are both irrelevant to character, not because people's opinions are meaningless, but because they are inconsistent, often uninformed and rarely aligned with truth. A person who masters immunity to criticism does not become unreachable. They become unshakable. They can listen without collapsing. They can improve without self-destruction. They can be corrected without losing identity. But this requires a shift that most people avoid, separating performance from worth. You can fail without being a failure. You can be wrong without being diminished. You can be criticized without being defined. Until this separation exists, your mind will always be vulnerable to external control. And here is the uncomfortable pattern connecting everything so far. When you cannot control your attention, you become reactive. When you cannot control your speech, you become exposed. When you cannot control your discipline, you become unstable. When you cannot control your need for approval, you become dependent. And dependence is the opposite of Stoic strength. So at this point, you are not being asked to adopt a philosophy. You are being confronted with a mirror, because Stoicism is not a belief system. It is a measurement system. It reveals the gap between who you claim to be and what your behavior proves. And that gap is either closing or it is growing. There is no neutral ground. The mind will resist this clarity. It will try to soften it. It will suggest that balance means lowering standards. It will suggest that self-compassion means tolerating inconsistency. It will suggest that life is complicated as a reason to avoid discipline. But complication does not cancel responsibility. It only increases the need for precision. The Stoics did not live in easier times. They lived in political instability, war, betrayal, uncertainty. Yet they trained their attention inward because they understood something modern life tries to erase. External chaos is not the problem. Internal fragility is. And fragility grows in one environment above all others: unexamined comfort. Comfort that is never questioned becomes identity. And once comfort becomes identity, discipline feels like suffering instead of liberation. This is where most people stop evolving, not because they lack potential, but because they refuse to disrupt the internal agreements that keep them comfortable. But if you are still listening, there is at least a part of you that already knows the cost of that comfort. You have felt it in delayed goals. You have felt it in broken routines. You have felt it in the quiet awareness that you are capable of more, yet consistently stopping short of it. That awareness is not a curse. It is a signal, and what you do with it determines everything that follows. Because the truth Stoicism keeps returning to in every form is simple. You either govern your mind, or your mind will be governed by everything except you. And most people never notice when the transfer of control happens. It happens gradually, in small compromises, in small distractions, in small surrenders that feel harmless in isolation. But accumulated over time, they become a life. The question is not whether you understand this now. The question is whether you will interrupt it. And interruption always begins the same way, with refusal. A refusal to negotiate with what weakens you. A refusal to explain away what you already know. A refusal to treat your lowest impulses as valid advisors, because they are not advisors. They are reactions. And reactions do not build anything worth living. For there is still more to confront. Deeper layers that will challenge not just your habits, but your entire interpretation of struggle, loss, and identity itself. But before that, what matters is whether you are willing to continue with the same level of honesty, or whether comfort will slowly reassert itself and soften everything you just heard into something easier to ignore. That decision is already forming in you now, whether you acknowledge it or not, and it will show itself in what you do next. Asterisk. Then understand this next truth, because it is where most people either evolve or quietly return to the same loop they swore they had escaped. Everything you resist is also shaping you, not metaphorically, practically. Repeated resistance creates a psychological imprint. Every time you avoid discomfort, you strengthen the part of you that believes discomfort is dangerous. Every time you face it, you weaken that illusion. This is why the Stoics did not treat hardship as an interruption of life, but as the raw material of it. They were not trying to escape difficulty. They were training perception so that difficulty no longer had authority over their decisions. Most people misinterpret adversity in the opposite direction. They assume hardship as a sign something is wrong, something to be minimized, delayed, outsourced, or avoided. But what if hardship is not an obstacle to the path, but the path itself, revealing where you are untrained? If you remove resistance from your life entirely, you do not become peaceful. You become fragile, because you have never built the internal structure required to remain steady when pressure arrives. That is why the Stoic principle of amor fati, the love of fate, is not emotional optimism. It is functional acceptance. It is the refusal to mentally fracture when reality does not conform to preference. It is the decision to use everything, not just what feels convenient. A missed opportunity is data. A betrayal is information. A failure is exposure. A delay is training in patience. Nothing is wasted unless you waste it through interpretation. And here is the part that demands honesty. Most suffering is not caused by events. It is caused by resistance to events already completed. The mind keeps replaying what is finished, arguing with what cannot be changed, and draining energy that could be used to build something new. The Stoic does not win by controlling outcomes. The Stoic wins by refusing to be psychologically occupied by what is no longer active. Now consider a deeper layer of this truth. If everything you resist shapes you, then your attention is not passive. It is formative. What you repeatedly focus on becomes the architecture of your mental world. This is why strategic control of attention is not optional. It is foundational, because attention is not just observation, it is reinforcement, and this leads to a brutal realization most people avoid. Your mind is not overwhelmed because the world is chaotic. Your mind is overwhelmed because your attention is undisciplined. The modern world does not force distraction. It offers it endlessly. And every acceptance of distraction is a small withdrawal from your capacity to direct your own life. Stoic discipline, therefore, is not about isolation. It is about filtration, learning what deserves entry into your awareness and what does not. Without this filter, your mind becomes a battlefield of external inputs competing for dominance. With it, your mind becomes a controlled environment where intention can actually survive. Now move to another truth that cuts even deeper into identity. You are not who you think you are. You are what you repeatedly tolerate. This is a difficult idea because it removes the comfort of identity as something fixed and reassuring. People prefer to think of themselves as stable entities with traits, labels, and explanations. But Stoicism strips that illusion away. It replaces identity with behavior, because behavior is the only reliable evidence of who you are becoming. If you tolerate distraction, you become distracted. If you tolerate inconsistency, you become unstable. If you tolerate avoidance, you become avoidant, not because you choose it once, but because you fail to interrupt it repeatedly. This is where self-discipline becomes identity formation rather than effort. You are not trying to be disciplined in a temporary sense. You are either reinforcing a disciplined structure or weakening it every single day through small permissions you give yourself. And here is the uncomfortable truth most motivational thinking hides. Motivation is not the problem. Permission is. People do not fail because they never feel motivated. They fail because they continuously grant permission to their lowest impulses. Now we arrive at a more confrontational Stoic principle. Indifference to outcomes that are not under your control is not emotional numbness. It is psychological efficiency. Most emotional instability comes from overinvestment in outcomes you cannot guarantee. Approval from others, timing of success, recognition, external validation, even fairness. When these become emotional anchors, your internal state becomes hostage to external unpredictability. Stoicism does not ask you to stop caring. It asks you to care correctly, to invest emotion where action exists and withdraw it where only speculation remains. This is why Epictetus emphasized that no one can be harmed by others unless they consent to internal interpretation, because interpretation is where control exists. 2. People can experience the same event and live entirely different realities. One becomes resentful, the other becomes sharpened. One collapses identity, the other extracts insight. The difference is not circumstance. It is internal governance. And this is where the Stoic life becomes unmistakably practical. Emotional mastery is not suppression. It is direction. Now consider a truth that most people avoid. Because it feels too final. Your future is not decided by your potential. It is decided by your patterns. Potential is infinite and meaningless without execution. Patterns are finite and revealing. They show what you actually do when comfort competes with intention. And patterns do not change through insight alone. They change through interruption. This is why Stoicism is not an intellectual philosophy. It is an interruptive one. It constantly forces you to break automatic responses so that conscious choice can replace them. Without interruption, the mind defaults. And default is always the path of least resistance. Now we move into something even more uncomfortable. Most people do not fear failure. They fear identity disruption. Failure is tolerable if identity remains intact. But discipline threatens identity because it demands change. It requires you to stop being the person who tries and become the person who executes. That transition is not comfortable. It removes excuses. It removes ambiguity. It removes the psychological shelter of inconsistency, and so the mind resists, not because discipline is hard, but because it is definitive. But here is the Stoic reversal. Clarity is not a threat. It is liberation. Unclear identity produces constant internal negotiation. Clear identity produces execution without debate. And every moment you spend negotiating with yourself is a moment lost to hesitation, disguised as thought. At this point, the philosophy converges into a single operational principle. Stop negotiating with what you already know. You already know when you are wasting time. You already know when you are avoiding discomfort. You already know when you are breaking promises to yourself. The problem is not awareness. The problem is tolerance, and tolerance of weakness is how strength dissolves slowly without notice. So the Stoic practice becomes simple, but not easy. Reduce tolerance for internal contradiction. Align action with knowledge faster. Shrink the gap between recognition and response, because that gap is where identity either strengthens or weakens. Now consider the final truth in this sequence, the one that integrates all the others. Your life is not built in moments of inspiration. It is built in moments of refusal to quit when effort feels unrewarded, refusal to react when ego is triggered, refusal to indulge distraction when focus is required, refusal to explain yourself when silence is stronger, refusal to abandon discipline when consistency feels inconvenient. These refusals are not dramatic. They are quiet, almost invisible, but over time, they accumulate into something undeniable: character. And character is the only advantage that cannot be taken from you. Everything else fluctuates. Circumstances change. Opinions shift. Opportunities come and go. But character determines how you respond when none of it is stable. That is why Stoicism is not about becoming emotionally detached from life. It is about becoming internally governed within it, because once internal governance is established, external instability loses its power to define you. And when that shift finally happens, life does not become easier, but you become harder to destabilize, more precise, more deliberate, less negotiable with distraction, less reactive to pressure, less dependent on approval. Not perfect, not untouched by emotion, but anchored. And that anchoring is what most people are unknowingly searching for when they chase motivation, validation, or external success. They are trying to stabilize externally what can only be stabilized internally, but there is no shortcut to that stability. Only repetition, only discipline, only refusal, only awareness turned into action. And now the question is no longer philosophical. It is behavioral. What will you continue tolerating after hearing this? Because whatever you tolerate next is already shaping who you become.